All right, welcome again to Ridge Church. Need a little help as we get started. I'm going to start the phrase. I want you guys to finish it. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but never has there been a more poetic sounding lie. Like if you've ever had your teenage child say to you, "I hate you," as they storm off and slam the door. If you ever had a boss say, "Hey, I really don't know what to tell you, but we're going to have to let you go." If you've ever had someone speak negative words over you in any context in your life, you didn't make the team. Maybe it was as simple as them saying, "Hey, you've been cut." Words are powerful. Maybe someone said, "Hey, you just didn't have what it takes." Or if you've ever heard this, like these are really weighty words. If you've ever heard someone, perhaps a father or someone in a position of authority over you, a coach, to say, "Hey, I'm so disappointed in you." Like words hurt. And it's not always just the words that are delivered. Sometimes it's the words that are absent, the words that should have been spoken that never were, that never were spoken, the words that we longed to hear but we never heard. Maybe it was as simple as you needing to grow up hearing someone say, "I love you," but you just didn't hear it, or you didn't hear it often. Maybe it was you needing someone to say to you, "I'm proud of you," and then you kind of walk your way into adulthood and realize no one has really ever said or articulated that or said it in a way that I could hear it. Words are powerful. Every single one of us, if I were to give you the microphone, you have a story of how words have shaped you, of the power of words. Words can shift an atmosphere. We learned this last week at the beginning of the service. I created quite the PTSD for some of you, so I won't do that again. If you weren't here, you should go back and listen. But words can shift an atmosphere. The words that are said, again, the words that are spoken, the ones that we wish had been spoken, can shape an atmosphere. And that's what we're talking about. So when I was young, my dad did not like to borrow things. Well, let me restate it. My dad never liked to borrow things. The story I'm about to tell was when I was young, and I remember it. So even to this day, my dad doesn't like to borrow things. Maybe like it's a generational thing. Probably at some level, it's like a personality thing. Certain personalities are like, "I just don't like to borrow things. I don't like to loan things out." But my dad didn't like to borrow things. And I remember this one scenario where, for whatever reason, we were in a pinch, and my dad did choose to break his own rule. But he specifically didn't like to borrow things from my grandfather, from his dad. Now, my granddad was a generous man, but he grew up in the Depression, and it was just different. You saw everything had a place, everything was neat and tidy, and you didn't really loan things. Everything, like, because they had to work so hard for everything and it was so valuable, you didn't loan things. And even though he's a generous man, it just didn't translate in that way. And then I remember this one time, my dad breaking his own rule. We didn't have a hedge clipper. I don't know how it went down, but I'm guessing somewhere behind closed doors, I wasn't around. My mom said, "Hey, hedges are looking pretty rough." My dad's like, "All right." So calls me, calls my grandfather. My grandfather has some hedge clippers. We don't have any. And so I get these hedge clippers, and I'm like, this is going to be great, right? This is not like, I don't like cutting grass, but I'm thinking to myself, I'm about to do some serious damage with these hedge clippers. I didn't know that it was actually going to be literal. I'll tell you that in a second. But I thought, I'm going to shape a poodle out of the shrubs in the front. It's going to be spectacular, right? And so I've got these things, and my dad is trying to do something that I don't know what I was, 10, 11 years old. No 10 or 11-year-old needs. He was trying to give me instructions. I'm like, I don't need those. He's trying to explain, because this thing can't go bad. We're already breaking the rule. He's borrowing something. He's trying to give me these instructions. And I'm like, "Dad, I got this. I've been born for 10 years. I got a solid bead on life, and I certainly can handle these hedge clippers." And so these are the kind that plug in. I plug them in. I'm starting to do the hedge clipper, and then I hear my dad yelling something. I'm like, "Dad, I got this." And at that moment, I cut right through the cord. And I heard my dad, it went real quiet. It was weird. I had just enough power to not hear my dad, and then there was no power, and then I had enough power to cut through the cord, and then it stopped. And then I heard my dad said, "Be careful, don't cut the cord." Right? So I'm holding this thing. My dad was so mad. He was mad at the whole thing. He's mad that the hedge clippers are broken. He's mad that I didn't listen. And he's mad that now we have to, in shame, go to my grandfather, to his dad, and say, "Hey, thanks for letting us borrow your hedge clippers," right? I'm talking about, I didn't have this thing more than 10 seconds, and I created havoc for our entire family line, right? The whole family is in jeopardy now because of the 10 seconds that I said, "I've got this." So the next scene, I don't know. I'm thinking like, it's all right, because here's the thing, and you guys, you get this. I didn't do it on purpose. Like, clearly, this was an accident. I didn't like set out that day thinking I'm going to mess up the family line or mess up the family Thanksgiving dinner. I'm not, like, I didn't like wake up thinking that. This whole thing was an accident. Since it was an accident, since it wasn't on purpose, it's fine, right? Nope. No, it was anything but fine. That was the day that I learned about electrical tape and about splicing wires, right? And we, in humiliation, I was able to present this hedge clipper back to my grandfather at some point, aesthetically altered forever, but functional, right? But in this reality, the fact that I didn't mean to do it didn't change the outcome. I can say all day long, I didn't mean to do it, it was an accident, it wasn't my intent. That was not how I meant for that to go. But meanwhile, I'm holding the hedge clippers in one hand and the frayed end of the wire in the other. The fact that I didn't mean to do it, the fact that it wasn't in my intent, the fact that it was an accident does not change the outcome. That's what I want to talk about for a few minutes today. The fact that intent does not change outcome. The fact that you don't mean to do something, the fact that I don't mean to do something, the fact that it was an accident doesn't change the fact that at times in our life, there's still something that's broken. And I'm just telling you, this idea that intent does not change outcome, nowhere is that more true than when it comes to our words. Like, just because you like find yourself in a position where you're like, hey, that's not how I meant that. You ever been there? Like, that's like you took that in a way that I did not intend it. That was an accident. I meant for that to be funny. You took it serious. In that moment, it doesn't matter what your intent was. It doesn't change the outcome on the other side. So in this series, we've been talking about the weight of words. We've been talking about these three dynamics with the weight of words. And listen, as I started off saying, and I'll share one of my stories today, we all, in ways that sometimes you have verbalized, perhaps you haven't. For some of you got married and this started to come out in your marriage. We've all been shaped by words, the ones spoken and the ones that were held back from us. And one of the things that I said last week, I think all humans, like in other words, regardless of your spiritual status, regardless of where you are in your spiritual journey, maybe you're here this morning and you wouldn't call yourself a follower of Jesus. Maybe you just say, I'm investigating, I'm not sure, I think I used to be. Regardless of whether you're a Christian or not, I think this applies to everyone, and everyone should pay attention to their words. But one of the things we said last week is that if you are a follower of Jesus, this isn't optional. If you are a follower of Jesus, if you would say, Jesus has changed my life, I've chosen to follow Jesus, how we handle our words is not optional. And one of the things that we said last week is when we follow Jesus, Jesus says, hey, I give you a new identity. You're salt, you're light. It's who you are. It's not what you do. And out of this new identity as sons and daughters, that we have a new definition to our lives. And out of that identity should flow a different reality. Our behaviors, our words, our interactions with people should be shaped by our identity. And so for those of us that are Christians, this isn't optional. I said this last week. I think this is so powerful. This is not original to me. I heard a pastor friend say this. But if you are not a follower of Jesus, and if you maybe you're a follower of Jesus and you know someone that's not, and you've been trying to invite them to church, if you're not a follower of Jesus, isn't it true that if we as followers of Jesus had been more cautious with our words, perhaps you would be more curious? For people that are sitting outside of this place that you try to invite them to come, I'm telling you, if we as followers of Jesus were more cautious, others be more curious about our faith, what makes us tick, what makes us go. But when they look and our words are just like everyone else's words, or our words bring harm or death when they could have brought help or life, then it doesn't create curiosity. So in this series, one of the things that I've invited those that are in the journey that aren't followers of Jesus to do is like, give us some grace. I would just tell you, if you've been banged up by a Christian, beat up by a Christian, messed up by a Christian, a follower of Jesus in some way, at the best day of our life, we're still just blurry reflections of who Jesus is. I want to invite you, if that's your story, to look past us, to look to Jesus, because he gets it right when we get it wrong. But we've also been challenging those of us who are followers of Jesus to think about this differently. So we're talking about these three dynamics with words. First week, Jim did such an incredible job talking about this idea that words are not all equally weighted. Like the negative words weigh way more than the positive words. Then last week we came back and talked about this idea that the source determines the weight. In other words, depending on who says it, a 5-pound word can become a 50-pound word, and we have to be stewards of those words. We have to recognize the positions that we've been put in and the role that we play in someone's life. And today, this one's probably the hardest one to explain, but as I've already mentioned, today I want to talk about this dynamic. The intent does not change outcome. I want to go back to my hedge trimming story. This will come as no shock. But as I held the hedge trimmer in one hand and the frayed wire in the other, I did what all 10-year-olds, and I think all humans, because it doesn't go away when we become adults, but I did what all of us do. I tried to explain myself. Like, there's an explanation for this, Dad. You see, I was working really hard, and there's a little sweat in my eye. I couldn't see very clearly. You know, there's a dog barking in the background. I couldn't hear your instructions, Dad. Like, I went into explanation mode. But none of my explanations did what they needed to do. None of the explanations helped, because at the end, as I had done all my best explanations as to why this happened and how it was unavoidable, at the end of my explanations, guess what was still in my hands? Broken hedge clippers. Cord in one hand, hedge clippers in the other. No explanation that I could give would repair. And here's the reality. In that moment, we didn't need an explanation, we needed a repair. And this is one of the things that I think is so important when it comes to our words. Explaining does not equal repairing. In fact, the same thing is true when it comes to our words, that our default when our words go rogue. Like when your words go in a place you didn't mean for them to go, land in a way you didn't mean for them to land, it happens to all of us. I just happen to be wearing a microphone a lot of times when it happens to me, so that's unfortunate. But when your words go rogue, it's going to happen, right? When it happens, our default, the thing that we most naturally, no one had to teach you to do this. You don't have to teach your children. No one had to teach you. Our default is to explain. But when we explain, when our words go rogue, what ends up happening oftentimes is we irritate the situation and we actually make it worse. Have you ever said, don't elbow anyone around you. Have you ever said, that's not how I meant that? I think I said this 5 times this week to my wife. That's not how I meant that. Or again, have you ever said like, hey, I was just lighten up. This is never helpful, by the way, in case you're wondering. Lighten up, I was just kidding. Like, have you ever like, maybe you've got your go-to phrase that when it gets heated, like you kind of, it's ultimately is an explanation, but it's like, hey, lighten up, or I'm just trying to be funny, or I didn't mean it that way, or the way you received it is not how I intended it. I want you to stay with me. But those phrases, when we say them, when we think them, or whatever your phrase is, maybe I didn't see your phrase, you got a phrase, those phrases indicate blame. Like, in other words, what we're doing in those moments is we're blaming the person that got hurt by saying this, ultimately. And this is not how we think about it. But we're saying, hey, it's not that I said it wrong, it's that you didn't receive it right. Like, it's not really on me. This is such an interesting thing. We're saying, hey, you're hurt, and I get that. You're hurt because you didn't receive it the way I intended it. You're hurt because you took this in a way that I didn't mean it. That's not how we mean it. But ultimately, when we use those kind of phrases, what we end up doing is we end up placing blame. And here's the thing. Explaining sounds like blaming, especially if you're the one who has been hurt by words. When you've been hurt and someone starts to explain themselves, all you hear in the back of your mind is they are just blaming. They're just an excuse, an explanation is just another way to blame. It's a subtle way, actually, to shift blame. And here's why it's so insidious, because we don't know what's happening, right? In fact, as I'm saying this, some of you are kind of playing back some of the things that you said and some of your normal mechanisms, and you realize this, we don't even know what's happening oftentimes. So I want to take a high-level look today. It's something that James said. James was one of the early pioneers of the church. For those of you that know the story of James, I'll tell a little bit of it here at the end. But James was the brother of Jesus, which I think is fascinating. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But James is the brother of Jesus, also a follower of Jesus, and also one of the early pioneers of the church. He talks a lot in his letter. He talks a lot in his book about the power of our words. And this is what he says in James chapter 3, verse 2. He says, we all stumble in many ways. Let me just stop there. Some of you are like, finally, James, thank you. I've been trying to tell my parents that for a really long time. I've been trying to tell my wife that. I've been trying to tell my husband that. James just goes out and says, hey guys, none of us are perfect. He says, we all stumble in many ways. And he continues, anyone who is never at fault in what they say, guess what that is? Words. Anyone who is never at fault in their words is perfect. Now, James is kind of poking at this obvious thing. He's saying none of us are perfect, and he knows this. In fact, he implicates this many times throughout the book of James, that none of us are perfect. So he's saying this, because we're not perfect, if you reverse engineer, he's saying because we're not perfect, sometimes, guess what? You're going to misfire when it comes to your words. Sometimes they're going to land in a way or a place or a time in which you didn't mean it to go that way, but it did, and it's really bad, and it's caused harm. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say in their words is perfect. But he's also saying this. He's saying if we can ever get on the front side of our words, this is like a cheat code to life. Like if you can ever somehow get your words harnessed and you're in charge of them instead of them in charge of you, you're in front of them instead of them in front of you. He's saying this will change the way that we live our lives. He's saying that if you can get charge of your words, if I can take control of my words, it literally can shape the trajectory of our life. He continues. A couple verses later, he gives a word picture. He says, I want you to consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. Like my family had the privilege a couple years ago to spend some time in Yellowstone. And some of you have seen it. You go through these spectacular landscapes, and then you'll just see thousands of trees that are charred, where entire portions of the forest have been burned down many years ago. Usually it's started by either a strike of lightning or a campsite somewhere. So it's just a little bit that starts. One lightning strike to take over a whole forest, one campfire, and one spark that goes rogue that takes over the whole forest. And then here's what ends up happening. If you can imagine, and some of you have seen this, I have a friend that leads a church in California, and so some of the wildfires there literally changed the dynamic of their whole church. A significant portion of their church moved out of the area when this happened. They lost their jobs. They lost their homes. It changed the entire economy of the area. A forest fire is a powerful thing. It can change dynamics. It can change homes. And he's using this metaphor on purpose. I think it's very interesting that he chose to use fire. Like some of you know this. Like literally when someone has a really good insult, they call it a burn. That's what it is. He's using this imagery. I love this version of the scripture. It says this. It says, the tongue is also a dumpster fire. That's the NICV version. In case you're wondering, that's the non-inspired Chris version. I just like to use it occasionally. I think maybe if James was living here today, he would have said it that way. It's like it's out of control. Like what's happening is just awful with our tongue. He's saying this, and I want to go back to this idea of explaining. I want to take what James says and go back to this idea of explaining with it. See, when we explain our hurtful words, here's what we end up doing. He's saying it literally, an explanation is like fanning the flame of this fire. It's a spark. But when we explain it, what it does is it makes it go crazy like a wildfire. It fans the flame. Our tongues start a fire at times. And this is interesting. James is not saying like if your tongue starts a fire. He starts off by saying this. It's subtle, but it's powerful. He says, if you're perfect, then you're perfect with your words. Implication, none of us are perfect, so you're not going to be perfect with your words. So James is saying this. This is the implication. It's not if, it's when. Some of you are getting elbowed right now, right? It's not if you go stray or go rogue with your words. It's when you go rogue. So he's saying this idea. He's putting these two things parallel. He's saying your words are like a spark that can create a forest fire. And the more we explain it, the more it goes out of control. And then he's also saying, and it's going to happen. So the question is, when it happens, how do we put out the fire? How do we extinguish the fire? If this is something that, sure, we're going to learn mechanisms to have more self-awareness and self-control, and hopefully we're going to get ahead of our words, but even the best of us at this, and I'm not one of them, even the best of you at this, at some point your words are going to get out of control. And the question is, to James, what James is saying and what he's putting down is, how do I extinguish the fire? And so James, just a few verses later in chapter 4, he actually gives insight to this. In this little part of James 4, he says that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. The way that you and I put out these fires that are started with our words is with humility. Plain and simple, humility. This is the thing. As long as we're explaining, we're probably not embracing the level of humility that we need. You got to come to a place with humility. It's this idea that even if I feel misunderstood, even if you feel misunderstood, it's coming to terms with the fact that the person on the other side of my words is more important than my explanation or my need to be understood. The person is more important. That's humility. It's saying the person is more important than my explanation, than my need to be understood. And that's a powerful dynamic. Years ago, I sat with a leadership coach, just felt like we didn't have a real good scoreboard for our leadership culture. Like, how do we measure when we have a healthy leadership culture as a church? And we came up with these 4 words. They've guided our culture and shaped our culture for over a decade. In the last 18 months, 24 months, I just knew that needed some reshaping. And so as early as this last year, we introduced 2 new words. I talked about one of them a couple weeks ago. But one of the new words that we introduced for our culture was this word, humility. And it's interesting, I felt like humility was a part of the culture. Like my team knows that, like for us, we put others first. Like we try not to believe our own press. We try to take the mission seriously, but not ourselves. I felt like it was kind of implicit, but it wasn't explicitly stated in our values. And so we finally put it on paper. And every time we have a value, and I think it'll be helpful for this conversation, because when James talks about humility, when he talks about this idea that humility is the thing that actually will extinguish the fires that our tongue puts in place, puts in motion, the question is, how do you do that? Like, that sounds good, but that's ethereal. How do I apply humility to this moment? So I think how we talk about this value of humility in our culture might actually help. We do a couple of things with every single one of the words. We come up with a definition. We have a quote. We have a couple of, like a phrase or a question that helps us kind of evaluate it, and then we'll have some examples. So this is how we define humility. It says humility is just freedom from pride or arrogance. It's an intentional decision to say, hey, you first. It's an intentional decision to say, you matter more than my explanation or my need to be understood. I love this quote from Thomas Merton. He was a monk. He says this. He says, pride makes us artificial and humility makes us real. In other words, humility brings the real you to the conversation. Explanation doesn't allow that. There's still a facade. It's not real. Humility brings the real you to any situation. I think humility is paramount to any healthy marriage. Humility is paramount to any healthy individual. Humility is paramount to any healthy culture. It's paramount to anything that you see that is healthy, including a human with their words. Humility has to be present if there is something of health. And this idea that he says pride makes us artificial, humility makes us real, it's the idea that it brings the real you to the conversation. It brings the real you to the conflict, even if there's conflict. It brings the real you to the controversy, where it's not just explaining, but you bring the real you. It's humility. We have this evaluating question because the whole thing with all of this is like, okay, well, how do I measure that? How do I measure humility? How do I see it play out in my life? So this is the question that we ask, and perhaps it's helpful as we think about our words today. We just ask this simple question: how are we making more of others? Like, just let that guide your marriage. Let that guide your parenting. Let that guide how you interact in the dorm room. Like, what if this became the guiding question for how we shape our words? I think this is one way to apply what James is talking about, that humility puts out. It extinguishes the fire that our words sometimes set in motion. If we just said, hey, how are we making more of others when it comes to our words? Wouldn't that put a different filter on our words? Does this thing I'm about to say, the way I'm about to say it, the timing in which I'm about to say it, does it make more of others? This is just one of our applications. We usually have several. Like, all right, here's how we do it. We say, by doing this, here's one of our applications. How do we do it practically? We say it this way, by saying, I'm sorry, please, and thank you. So simple, but so powerful. See, when I say I'm sorry, here's what I'm saying. I'm saying I take responsibility. Like, I'm sorry. I own it. It was me. When I say please, you know what I'm saying? I'm saying I'm not above you. Like, I'm not above you. Like, please, could you please do this for me? Will you please? When we say thank you, we're saying I wasn't owed this. You did something for me that wasn't owed to me. Thank you. And let me just tell you, these are power words. These aren't words that spark forest fires. These are words that extinguish them. These are just examples of I believe James is talking about. That it's not if, it's a matter of when our words start a fire. And James says, there's got to be something that extinguishes it, and it's humility, and it's words and phrases that carry humility. So here's the application. I dare you to put these words at play in your life, to put these words at play in your marriage, in your relationship, on the ball team, again, in the dorm room, wherever your office is. They're power words, and they shape the dynamics of relationships. And if these become normative in your leadership and your relationships, it changes everything. I mean, I bet not a lot of you have bosses that say, I'm sorry very often. If you show me a marriage that's being successful, I bet you'll find a lot of these words present. I bet you'll find someone that takes ownership quickly, that says please and thank you. Some of you hear all this and you say, but Chris, here's the thing. I hear that, and when I think about my life, and when I think about some of the situations, and when I think about even the political scene or whatever it is, some of you say, yeah, I hear all that, Chris, but here's the thing. I didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. Young people don't know what you're laughing at. That was an old people joke. Billy Joel, anybody? Explanations, they elevate me. But humility elevates the other person. Yeah, maybe we didn't start the fire. Maybe you didn't start the fight. Maybe you didn't say the first word, but somebody has to go first in bringing the extinguishing words to the reality. James began this thought at the end in James chapter 1. He kind of gives the big idea. We talked about James 3, some of the verses, and then James 4, but this is how he started. He said, my dear brothers and sisters, James said, this is a male and female problem. I'd like to go on record, James said that. This is an everybody problem. Male, female, doesn't matter the age. He says, my brothers and sisters, take note of this. He said, I want you to pay attention. Guys, lean in. If you've dozed off, I want you to pay attention. He's saying, I want you to pay attention to this. This is so important. Take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak. You've heard that thing, we got 2 ears and 1 mouth, but for a reason, right? He's saying, listen, you've got to understand the weight of your words. They're not neutral. They carry gravity. And especially if you're a follower of Jesus, this applies even more. This is not an optional thing. This isn't a, hey, you should try this. This is a responsibility. You've got to allow your words to be shaped by the identity inside of you. Your words weigh so much. Take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Humility becomes the extinguisher. When we're quick to apologize, when we're quick to step into a space with words that extinguish, when we take ownership and we don't just shirk the responsibility, when we don't explain ourselves away, we can stop the fires. There's one scene that stands out in my mind, one of my personal stories. It's the greatest illustration for me personally of the power of both positive words and negative words. I shared part of this story at some point in the past, but I've never shared the whole story. When I was in high school, my one thing was sports. Every waking hour, specifically basketball. I played soccer, played some other things too, but specifically basketball. I was like every young kid going to be an NBA star, and then I'm like, yeah, but I'm not going to be one, right? But I loved it. Everything about it. It was my life. And when I was a junior, I was playing on the varsity basketball team, and I say playing lightly. I was mostly warming the end of the bench and helpful as a practice dummy. That summer before my junior year, I had a starting position. A new kid came in, transferred in. Kid was better than me, took my starting position. And so now I got no playing time. And so I thought I was going to be starting. Instead, I'm down at the end of the bench. I never get any playing time. And I never forget this game as long as I live. It stands out. I was 17 years old when this happened. But I'm sitting down at the end of the bench, and we're playing this team, has a kid that's top 10 in the state, and he's really good, point guard, really, really good. So our starting point guard that had taken my position, he gets a couple of fouls really quickly. I think 3 fouls pretty early. And I just hear someone yell, hey, Brown, get in there. And I remember looking around like thinking, who's he talking to? And I realized, oh, it's me. I'm the only Brown. It's me. Like, I still got my warm-ups on. I'm down at the end of, I'm not prepared. So I'm like, trying to get out. I'm cold. I'm not ready for this. Listen, I'm not getting any playing time. And so he puts me in. I go in, and I'm guarding this guy that's top 10 in the state. Top 3 sounds better. Top 3 in the state, right? And And he was just good. He was faster. He was a better shooter. He was just better than me. And he was faster than me. And so much like the first point guard, our starting point guard, I ended up getting 3 fouls really quickly. And so, I'm not in 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes max. I don't think I was even in 5 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. And so the coach calls a timeout in order to get me out of the game. But before I get to the huddle, he meets me at the middle of the court, and he grabs me by my jersey, and he puts his finger in my face, packed gymnasium, wall to wall. And he starts to yell at me. And he yells at me through the timeout. I sit on the bench. I didn't play any of the rest of that half. We got to the locker room, and I thought, whew, I'm glad that's over. And he ended up taking the entire halftime speech to belittle me. Like, literally didn't say another thing to any of the other players. He just belittled me, demoralized me. His words were directed at demoralizing me, and I'm just telling you, it worked. I mean, his words started a forest fire in my self-esteem. Like, it just did so much damage. And I would say this, like, I think there are times when I think about culture that I think sometimes culture is a little too sensitive. Like I said last week, I think there are times we need correction. There are times we need alignment. But this wasn't coaching. This was an adult using their position of authority to verbally abuse a teenager, and it was absolutely devastating. It happened on a public stage for me. At the end of the game, I didn't play anymore the rest of the game. At the end of the game, after the game speech was also directed at me. It's funny, I think back on it, and I wonder, I don't understand it. I'm like, what happened? Something happened in this guy's life that he took this out on some 17-year-old kid that just played 4 minutes of basketball, and I didn't do great, that's obvious. But he just, all over again, he just lit into me. And I got in the car that night. I think my parents had dropped me off at the game. I got in the car with my parents, my mom and my dad, and I'll never forget this. I just was looking out the window of the car, and I was already my own worst critic then and today, just needing everything to be right, to do it right. And I was just looking out the car window, and I was just defeated. I was humiliated. I was embarrassed. I was believing the words that this coach had spoken over me. I'm like, he's right. I was terrible. It was all my fault. And I'll never forget this. My dad, he was quiet for a few minutes. And my dad's kind of he didn't have a lot of words, but when he said words, you listened. He said this. He said, son, I saw what happened. I'm like, I bet you did. Everybody in the gym saw what happened. He said, you didn't deserve that. I'm sorry. And he just kind of paused, bumbled his way through the next few things. He said, I promise you that'll never happen again, and I'm going to handle this. My dad was saying in his own way, hey, Chris, the nonsense ends here. What happened to you wasn't okay, and it's never going to happen again. And I just tell you, I got choked up several times as I was preparing this, thinking about it. I just can't even tell you how much my dad's words weighed that day. They echo in my mind as an adult. Like, they were 1,000 pounds, my dad's words. Like, I'm in this moment where I'm just broken. And to hear my dad say this, he says, I see you. Chris, I understand you. To see him come to my defense, he could have said, well, you did get 3 fouls really fast, yeah, I did. He didn't say any of that. He came to my defense. And here's the beautiful part. He did for me what I could not do for myself. I did not have power. I did not have authority in that situation. I was broken and I was underneath it, and my dad kept his word. The very next day, he unenrolled me in that school. I never went back. And it wasn't my dad, that wasn't the way my 3 brothers had gone through that school, or my 2 brothers had gone through that school. It was like, this was a big deal for us. He unenrolled me, and by the end of the week, he had me enrolled in a new school that there was a significant cost to he and my mom. Words matter. Words have the power of life or death. They can speak life over us. They can bring death to us. Our words can start a forest fire, or like my dad's words that day, they can bring an extinguisher. They can bring salve to a wound in a marriage, a wound for a father and a son, a mom and a daughter, a nation. Words are powerful. Solomon says this, talks about the idea that our words can give life or they can bring death. So James, I think, gets it right. He says, listen, because of the power and the intensity that words have, the ability to shape and shift an atmosphere, he says it, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I want to close a little differently today. The fact that James, who wrote this, is the brother of Jesus is perhaps for me one of the most convincing proofs of Jesus. Any of you, how many of you in the room have brothers and sisters? Like, what would it take for your brother or sister to convince you that they were the Son of God? I mean, I'm thinking pretty much nothing that my brothers could do except for die and rise from the dead and me see them afterward. And even then, I might still question it with them, right? This is such a powerful thing. James is the brother of Jesus, and at the end, he is still a follower of Jesus, literally to his death. In fact, here's the reality. We really only see him rise onto the scene after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus as a prominent figure in the church. The Jewish historian Josephus, this is what we call extra-biblical. It's during biblical times. He was a historical source, but this is not in the Bible. Josephus, again, Jewish historian, he says this, that James the Just, talking about the brother of Jesus, was dragged outside at the end, dragged outside the gates of Jerusalem, and that he was stoned. But as he breathed his last breath, he still believed that his brother, Jesus, was the Son of God. And I believe that there's a lot of reasons, but I believe it really kind of comes down to this one thing. Not too many days before the realities that ensued for so many of the disciples and the persecution that happened for them, the followers of Jesus watched in horror as their rabbi. James watched as his brother was carted off, beaten, mocked, and put on a cross. And the scriptures tell us that they were in hiding for fear that the same might happen to them, but many of them watched from the back of the crowd or in some hiding spot. But as these men watched, and I can only imagine what happened as they watched from a distance and they heard and they experienced. And I believe this is the reason that James was still a follower of Jesus all the way to his death. They watched and they heard as Jesus drew his last breath, and he said what I believe are the three most powerful words ever spoken in human history. He said, "It is finished." And then just under 3 days later, they encountered the resurrected Jesus. They had conversations with him. They had meals with him. And I believe in that reality, James not only heard those words, he experienced the power of those words. It is finished. I don't want you to miss this. When Jesus said, "It is finished," this was God the Father saying, like my dad, I see you. I understand you. I'm coming to your defense. I'm going to do for you what you can't do for yourself. And this was God the Father saying through Jesus, I'm going to handle this for you. Feel the gravity of those words. It is finished. Jesus knew that you and I were out of our depth. That there was something that needed to happen on our behalf that we could not do for ourselves. And so these three most powerful words in human history are dropped on us. When he says it is finished, do you know what this means? We talk about this a lot around here. It means you don't have to perform for his love. It means it's not about how bad you are, it's about how good he is. It's not about how good you are, it's about how good he is, because your good is never good enough and your bad is never too bad. It is finished. It's not about performance. It's not about your religious performance. It's not about your attendance or how much you give or how much you do or how good you are or even getting all your words perfect. It is finished. I want you to imagine that after my dad tells me these words, right? After he says, "Hey, Chris, I'm going to handle this for you." I want you to imagine 2 or 3 days later, I come back and say, "You know what, Dad, I've been thinking about it. I just don't want you to do this for me. I can do it." My dad would say, "No, Chris, it's handled. It's done." This is what Jesus is saying. We can't come back to him and say, "But I'll perform, but I'll do, but I'll." He said, No, you don't understand, son. You don't understand, daughter. You can't do it because it's done. It's finished. Later, the Apostle Paul, who had this radical encounter with Jesus. He encountered the resurrected Jesus. He hated the church. He encounters the resurrected Jesus, or Jesus after the resurrection, and then he flips upside down his life, and he becomes one of the greatest architects of the church. He would say this in Romans 10, 9 and 10. It says, if you declare with your mouth, what is that? Words. Words. Words are powerful. It says, if you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead. And he says this, you will be saved. Not like maybe, not like, man, I'm hoping I did enough. No, it's not about that. Because of the finished work of Jesus, this is it. You will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth, what is that? Words, that you profess your faith and are saved. I believe that these are the three most powerful words any human will ever speak. When you come to the place, the recognition, we come to a realization that I am a sinner in need of a Savior, and I can't do this on my own. Perhaps you've tried. I've tried. When you come to that realization and you finally say, Jesus is Lord, these three words embed us in the three words of Jesus. It is finished. When we say, Jesus is Lord, it is finished, is fully applied to our lives. Forever and for everything. And it's powerful. Earlier this year, I'm going to ask the band to come out. They're going to close in a song. We did this series. We kicked off the year with a series called Rescued. And we gave these locks. In fact, I want you to reach under your chair. There's a lock under every single one of them. I want you to grab this. And you can keep this. You can hold it in your hands as we close in this song if you want. But when I gave these locks out, the idea in this series, it was called Rescued, was this: it is finished. It's past tense. When Jesus rescued us, certainly he continues to walk through us, but it is finished means that it's accomplished, that every battle you will ever walk through, everything you will ever face, he has already won the victory. The band's going to close with a song today that talks about that. It's kind of our theme song for the year, if you will, but it talks about how the fact that the battle's already won. And it's really rooted in these three words of Jesus, the most powerful words ever spoken, in my opinion, in human history. It is finished, meaning every battle you have ever faced, including everything you've ever done, everything that's been done to you, every battle you will ever face, everything you will do, everything that will be done to you, every single one of those things, it's done. The battle is won. Sometimes we're striving and striving and striving, and Jesus says, rest, child. It's not due. You don't have to do this. You can't do this because I've already done it. And the thing that triggers us to be included in this story is what Paul says, coming to a realization, I believe in my heart, and I confess with my mouth that Jesus is Lord. And so what we said with these locks, and I've had some really cool stories coming out of these, I said, you're going to hold a lock. And every time that someone publicly declares their faith in Jesus through baptism, we're going to put a lock on the rescued fence that's out in the foyer. And we've had a lot of people already do that. And I said, as you hold this lock, for some of you, I want you to pray for your friend. Many of you in this room, you're already followers of Jesus. I want you to pray for someone that you know that hasn't followed Jesus yet, that when they meet him, it's going to revolutionize their life. And I said this, and this is true today. For some of you, you got the lock in your hand, and it's not for someone else. It's for you. And when the time is right for you to put your faith in Jesus and declare it with your mouth, publicly declare it through baptism, we're going to put your lock on the fence. We've already had people that were sitting in that service that said the lock was for me. It's been a beautiful, beautiful journey. But here's what I want to invite you to. If you're a follower of Jesus, let this song just be, can we just pull back for a second? Maybe it's just another Sunday, but maybe not. Can you just pull back for a second and just be in gratitude that it is finished, has been applied to your life, your marriage, your parenting, your budgets, all the stuff. Like whatever middle school, high school, college reality you find yourself in, your first job, like he is with you and he has accomplished it. Let this be a moment of declaration. But for some of you, what you need is 60 seconds of courage. 60 seconds of courage just to say, Jesus is Lord, and to publicly identify with him through baptism. Waters are ready. All we need is you. To say, hey, I'm in. Some of you know you've been needing to do this. Some of you didn't come in today prepared for this, but you know it's the time. We'd love for you to take that step. We do something at our church called Believer's Baptism. And what we mean by that is we do this because it's a decision that you make. You don't feel like this is a decision that your parents can make for you. This isn't something that you get just because you're born in a certain zip code or because of how good you've been. This is about you choosing to put your trust in Jesus. And we believe that when someone does that as an adult, as a believer, then we can be a part of believers' baptism. And so I just want to ask you, 60 seconds of courage as we sing this song could change your life. Would you be willing to do it? If you're a follower of Jesus, celebrate in these moments. In a moment, we're going to stand and sing this song. And when we do, songs maybe 4 or 5 minutes, 60 seconds of courage. Some of you say, that's really cute, Chris, but I didn't bring any clothes for that. We've got all that stuff covered. You say, well, yeah, but what about, I don't have my family's not here. I'd want them to be here for this moment. We have professional photographers, videographers, all of it's going to be captured. You say, what about my hair? It's important, right? It's like, Chris, you don't know how long it takes. This is a situation, right? We have everything you need. The only thing you need, 60 seconds of courage. Some of you are followers of Jesus, but you've never declared it publicly. I believe the power of Jesus' words, it is finished, combined with the power of our words, when we come to this place of saying Jesus is Lord, will change the atmosphere of this room today. And so I want to pray over us. I want to ask you to have courage. Let me pray for us. Jesus, Father, I just want to ask you, will you give us courage today? Give us courage. Will you speak life over this room? God, there's some that just need to hear us say that you're a Father that loves us, that you don't disapprove, you approve. Thank you for your words over us that shift our lives when you say it is finished. Thank you for handling for us what we could not handle on our own. I pray that these next few moments will be a moment of epic celebration. Give us courage and freedom in this room. In Jesus' precious and powerful name we pray. In the resurrected name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Will you stand with us? If you'd like to be baptized, today's your moment. Here's all you got to do. At some point, just turn, walk out that aisle. Guest service is going to take care of you, take care of the rest. 60 seconds of courage. But if you're a follower of Jesus, let this song, let these words be a declaration and a reminder and a moment of gratitude.